Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. If you love our content, consider supporting us on our Patreon page. Our podcast will always be free, but our production cost is not. There's a considerable amount of time and money that goes into every episode. We love what we do, and we believe that we are giving you a fresh perspective on the tarot and witchy community. But we would also love the support of our listeners. www.patreon.com/WeWitches3 to go and check out if any of our offers interest you. We have created all kinds of witchy and psychic content for you to enjoy. That's www.patreon.com/WeWitches3. This is the We Witches 3 podcast, where you will hear the opinion of 3 seasoned witches who are tired of glossy, tunnel vision, love and light accolades about serious metaphysical topics. Your hosts, Charlene, Maria Sewell, and Heather Woodworth, have been practicing witches and professional psychics for over 20 years. They not only have the experience, but they have the research to back it up. So get comfortable on your brooms, grab a snack, and get ready for a wild ride. Are you wondering when love will enter your life? Want to know when he'll call you? Need guidance on what path to take? Nicole has been reading tarot and developing her skills for over 20 years. If you're looking for an honest, accurate reading with no fluff and judgment-free, book a reading today with Nicole by going to www.persephonescharm.com. While there, you can join the mailing list to stay up to date with any online and personal events, catch up weekly videos, and a free weekly oracle reading every Monday. Don't forget, that is www.persephonescharm.com.
I'm Pam Grossman. I am a writer. Most recently, I have a book out called Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power. And I imagine we'll be digging into that quite a bit. It's a nonfiction book, and it is essentially my excavation and celebration of the archetype of the witch, especially the more positive aspects of witches and how witches have gone to, or from rather, primarily evil, diabolical figures to incredible, transformative feminist icons. In addition to that, I'm the creator and host of a podcast called The Witch Wave, in which I interview all kinds of amazing people who either identify as witches or who are interested in witches or who embody the archetype of the witch in their artistic work or their writing or other vocations. And on that podcast, I've had everybody from the author Madeline Miller, who wrote the wonderful book Circe, to drag queen Jinx Monsoon, to the hood witch Brie Luna. So it's a really intentionally diverse group of people, both in terms of their own identities, but also in terms of their own approaches to witchcraft and magic. And that's been a real joy to work on. And in addition to all that, I do a lot of writing and curating of art shows. And I'm most interested in the overlap between magic, creative practice, and gender. So somewhere in my work, no matter what it is I'm working on, you'll probably find one, two, or all three of those things represented and explored.
What I am interested in, I know this is totally off topic, but in your bio, it says you have a witch emoji app.
Yes, it's a sticker app. So for iPhones, there are these things called stickers, which people might be familiar with. A few years ago, I'm trying to remember when it even came out. Was that 2017 or 2016? I was really frustrated because at the time there was no emoji for witches. And now there are witch-looking characters that the Unicode committee calls a mage figure, but looks like a witch, and there's a guy witch and a lady witch. But when I made these emoji, or the sticker pack rather, there weren't any, and I was really frustrated about it. And so I worked with an amazing designer, and together we came up with a way in which people could, express their witchly selves through their texting on iPhones. And it's still going strong.
I appreciate that frustration a lot because, emojis are very, very popular now. And whenever I keep looking at the Halloween pack for a witch, and there's no brooms or hats or anything.
Exactly. So in addition to there being all kinds of witch faces of different skin tones and genders, our emoji pack or our sticker pack also has things like, a black cat and a broomstick and cauldron and candle and all of those wonderful witchly accoutrements, which come in handy when you're trying to communicate your witchly self via texting. So it was a really fun project to work on. And yeah, people still seem to be scooping it up, which is really lovely.
I love it. We are definitely emoji spell people. We in our Facebook group, we create emoji spells all the time. And so when I read about that, I was ecstatic because I was like, oh, that's so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, it definitely was like necessity is the mother of invention kind of project, but it was super duper interesting to also really work with a designer and figure out how to distill these images down to something that felt modern and still cute and fun and be as universal as possible too, because that's always been really important to me. I think in the witchcraft community and in witch storytelling in general, so often images of witches default to being Caucasian or being of European descent. And as we know, witches span the globe and they always have. So it's very important to me that that's reflected in the guests that are on my podcast and in what I write about, and certainly in the witch emoji sticker pack as well.
So tell me about this book. What made you want to write something like this? It's completely different than anything I have ever read out there, and it's timely for sure.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me to hear. And honestly, that's the reason that I wrote it, because I am such a huge fan of all things witch. And it's both my spiritual practice as a pagan person and as someone who identifies as a witch. But I'm also a big fan of witches, and I'm really interested in the symbol of the witch and how it's evolved over time in fine art and in the stories that we tell, in fashion, in politics, and so on. And so what I was hoping for was to find a book that would kind of weave all of these threads together. And unfortunately, or I suppose fortunately for me, such a thing never existed. You can certainly find a lot of books on the practice of witchcraft, or books on just the image of the witch in fine art, or just the history of the witch hunt or the Salem witch trials. All of these different fragments. I think the closest that has come out that sort of does what I hoped my book would do is Ronald Hutton's book, The Witch, which is a really great kind of comprehensive look at the history of witches. And he's a huge inspiration for me. But even that book, it's very dense. It's very academic. It doesn't really talk too much about pop culture, which I think has a huge influence on our notions of the witch. And furthermore, the idea of how feminism and witches have influenced each other is one that to me is at the heart of this symbol. And there are very few books out there that really explore that. One of them was written by a dear friend of mine, Kristen Soleil. That's the book Witches, Sluts, Feminists. And she does a really nice job of kind of focusing on the feminist history. But again, that's just one aspect of it. So I wanted to kind of see if I couldn't weave it all together in one tapestry and add a sprinkle of my own personal history and, exploration of my identity as a witch on top of it too. So a pretty tall order.
Absolutely. I feel like this book, in fact, I was telling the girls right before we started, I feel like this book is going to go on my virtual shelf at this point, next to Drawing Down the Moon, as like my must-have witch primers, because it really does weave the social context of witch all through history. So it's not just focused on like the archaeological evidence or the academic aspects of it, but how a witch actually existed in the world as experienced by people.
Thank you so much. Margot Adler is a huge inspiration for me. I'm really heartbroken that I never got to meet her because her life was unfortunately taken too soon. But her book is also one that was hugely informative for me and very affirming for me as a younger person to see that the study of witchcraft and one's identity as a witch was worthy of exploration and thought, because I think so often witches are sensationalized and, you know, or they're trivialized, right? It's often one of the two poles, you know, either you're a threat or you're considered diabolical or dangerous or super sexy. You know, there's all this sensational aspect to witches. And then on the other side, people tried to dismiss it and say anybody who believes in witches or is interested in witches is a fool. You know, haven't they heard of science and so on? And so Margot Adler's book really affirmed for me that this is worthy of, you know, caring about and studying with rigor and seriousness, but also hopefully a sense of fun too, which is always important to me in my writing, that it doesn't just feel heavy and dry.
And I was so excited reading it because in reading the Teen Witch chapter that you wrote, I realized that I'm all of a year older than you.
We're in that weird generation, that weird, not quite Gen X, not quite millennial generation.
And so, but you and I were kind of going through the same explorations at similar times. Because my mother was a metaphysician when I was growing up. And so I went a step further and I became a witch in high school.
Right on.
So you were kind of, the personal vignettes you were sharing in the book were very similar to what happened in my own life, in my own explorations. And so I found that really fascinating, especially in that particular chapter, because you're sharing this information about all these lessons we get taught through these movies and stuff about how women are supposed to be afraid of their burgeoning powers. Because, yeah, first it's all fun and games, but then, like, it gets out of hand and we have to be put back in our place. And so that was the same thing I was railing against in my youth, too. And in my 20s, I was just so mad about it. And I tell people that's when I found my angry young man stage and I started listening to heavy metal and all that.
Yeah. So for listeners who might not know how old we are, so I was born in 1981. So I'm 38. Sorry, I'm blowing up your spot. If you were going to keep your age secret,
no,
you can edit that out.
I'm turning 39, so technically I'm Gen X, and technically you're a millennial. So.
Oh my goodness! It's so crazy. It's so crazy. But it's a funny time period, and I feel really blessed to have come of age during that time, because I didn't grow up with the internet, and yet I am young enough that I remember getting my first email account, and I remember going on to America Online and coming up with the screen name, and oh my goodness, Amazon.com and eBay, and suddenly I could find all this cool rare material. So, and yet, you know, as a non-native digital person or non-digital native, I had a childhood that was steeped in having to make my own fun and use my imagination and wander in the woods and read a lot and write a lot and paint a lot. So I think it's a really lucky time that you and I grew up in. And this is also the time of kind of the third wave of feminism with Riot Girls and scene culture, and even things like the Anita Hill hearing, you know, and people railing back against sexual harassment. And I don't know, all of that was very much in the air. And so a lot of the depictions of witches that we saw in movies like The Craft, or in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or Charmed. A lot of those tropes were about, isn't it awesome that teen girls are powerful, but like the power might take over if you're not careful, and don't be too angry and don't want too much vengeance and don't overprotect yourself. And so I actually was not that into The Craft. And as I write in the Teen Witch chapter of my book, like, I think it's iconic for a lot of great reasons. It's amazing that they had, for the time, a relatively diverse cast, and that one of the 4 women is a woman of color. And, certainly the fashion and the, screw you, badass kind of swagger that the witches have is really cool and semi-feminist. But yeah, I mean, at the end, they kind of, the lesson is very much like, girls will go wild and they will be out of control and they'll end up turning on each other and, use their magic for evil. And that always really pissed me off, because it just wasn't something that I could fully relate to, and it wasn't the kind of witch I wanted to be. I like dark, shadowy things, but I like holisticness, and I definitely have made my mistakes and have had my dark moments, but in general, my magic has been about being generative and creative and compassionate. So yeah, I don't know. I didn't really relate to the film The Craft and things, even though it was in the air and very influential.
Yeah, I had kind of viewed, like, when The Craft came out, I thought, like, oh yeah, those are just like baby poser witches. That's how they act. Even though, like, I was the same age as the characters. But in the same vein, though, like, The Craft outed me to all my friends.
Oh, interesting. That's
yeah,
really
so they kind of looked at me and they were like, if they do that and they're witches and you do that, that means that you're also a witch. And I was like, got me.
Yeah. I also kind of felt like I was, I don't know, a legend in my own mind, I suppose. And that stuff was like basic witch, popular witch culture, and what I was doing was the real stuff. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Which is so silly, but it was, and yeah, certainly a self-protective device for sure. In the same way I was like, oh, I'm into all these cool bands and no one else should be into that. You know what I mean? It's just a ridiculous defensive posture when you're feeling insecure, and so you want to double down on your individuality. So yeah, I'm sure that was part of it too. But I really love the new teen witches. I love that, the later generations after us grew up with Hermione, and I love the new Sabrina in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix. I mean, these are awesome feminist, social justice warriors, and I say that with a positive connotation. People who really are railing against the patriarchy in ways that I think are inherent in the modern witch archetype for sure.
So how did you become a witch so young? You tell stories of being like 14 and 15. And I mean, I know we all kind of started in that age, but are your parents witches, or are they religious, or how did that all come about?
Yeah, so my parents are Jewish and I was raised Jewish. So sometimes I call myself a Jew witch because it's not something I've entirely turned away from. There are still aspects of my heritage and certainly my family history that are really important to me. And, certain holidays I celebrate a bit spiritually and mostly culturally. But my parents are both very artistic. My mom is a painter and my dad is a musician, though they've had various day jobs over the years. And they always encouraged my older sister and I to be ourselves. And they're both very spiritually open. So my mom would go on goddess retreats, and my dad was and still is into meditation and Buddhism. My older sister, as she grew up, became Buddhist. So, we just have a very open family, and they've always been really supportive.
You talk a lot about your sister, too, and how you were kind of her grounding force. Did that shape your witchcraft in any way, or how you look at witchcraft?
Yeah, so you're referring to a point in the book where I talk about my older sister who struggled with very severe mental health issues. I always say she's now, an adult and she's thriving and stable and, turned into a really incredibly wonderful person. But when we were both teenagers and young adults, she struggled very badly with what was diagnosed as manic depression, which we now call, being bipolar. And in the 90s, there just wasn't as big of an understanding. There was certainly a lot of stigma around it. And so she struggled very, very badly, and it would manifest in just her not being able to control her emotions. And she would have really big, scary emotions and was sometimes a danger to herself and others. And she was a really volatile force in my life and in my, adolescence and young adulthood. So, as I write in the book, I definitely think my magic making became something I leaned harder into. Like, that was grounding for me, because no matter how bad things got in my household, I could go out on the roof and commune with the moon and, ask Artemis for help. And my room really became this magic circle where I felt protected. And, I had my walls absolutely covered with what I would call holy icons, but they were posters of all the bands I loved and artists and musicians I admired, and, artworks that were sustaining and fortifying for me. So I do see my magic as something that gave me a lot of strength and anchoring in a very volatile time. And I also, interestingly enough, see her mental health struggles as her own kind of, I don't know, like there's kind of a metaphor there that I dig into a bit in that Teen Witch chapter of like her not being able to control her power and having to learn, to hone it. So yeah, there's certainly, I could spend all day long talking just about that time in my life, because it was really, really difficult. But I'm grateful that I had magic to feel like it was a protective and positive element for me in that time.
That is so hard, especially as a teenager. It's hard on anybody. And then to also be a teen and be having your own struggles it's just a lot.
Yeah, it really was, because, I was certainly going through my own stuff. I was a really sensitive kid, a really imaginative, creative kid. And that means in the suburbs of New Jersey where I was growing up, there weren't very many people that I could relate to. I was lucky I had a really dear best friend who in the book I call Molly. And, she would occasionally come along and do some spells with me and things. And, it's hard. It's a hard time of life. And also I think one of the reasons that there are so many teen witch tropes is because the teen witch is also a metaphor, because even if, you never do actual magic, you're going through all of these transformations and changes that you do feel out of control of. Your body is changing. You're suddenly having all these ideas about yourself and who you want to be. And that's often at odds with who your parents want you to be, or who your school wants you to be, or your peer group. And so I do think that there's a lot of kind of rich veins to mine in regard to teen witch literature and films and so on, because it says so much about how we feel about female power and about young people stepping into their power or feeling out of control of their power and being afraid of it, or other people being afraid of, whether it's young female sexuality or young female intelligence or autonomy. There are so many different interesting takeaways from analyzing teen witch pop culture, I think.
Absolutely. And I want to say too, just now we're talking about especially how women have to go through this transition as teens, but you make it very clear in the book that we're not just talking about witches as a female or a cisgender topic, how even though it has been emphasized as one over the years, but it also affects the more gender inclusive community and male and masculine identifying persons as well. And I thought that was really amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say it's something I was really mindful of, and I worked really hard on. But I confess it's also very tricky because. And I say right up front in the intro of the book that anybody can be a witch, anybody can be identified as a witch or identify as a witch themselves. Yet it is an archetype that has historically been associated with women. And it's important that we dive into that because at the root of that is a history of misogyny and patriarchal oppression. So I do spend the majority of the book really sifting through the ways in which women and witches have been linked together and how that came to be and what that says about our fear and our fantasies about female power. But I'm happy that you're emphasizing the point that certainly anybody can be a witch. That's for sure.
I was fascinated by what you were talking about, going back to, we were talking about teen witches, but then in other chapters you were talking about the crone and how we're okay with like younger witches having power, but it always gets taken away from them because they don't know how to use it. But then once you become a crone or once you become older, then all of a sudden you sort of cease to exist.
Absolutely. I think and that's what's so interesting. So if you just look at depictions of witches in visual culture, for example, and I'll just start for argument's sake with a lot of the witch images that are first replicated, which is, around the time of the advent of the printing press. We're talking 15th century, primarily in like the Germanic regions of Europe, although it gets disseminated throughout Europe and the rest of the world eventually. But these early images of witches often were shown either as young and sexy and seductive or old and hideous and often still naked and sexual. And how both of these things are considered, by the creators of the images and by the writers of these witch hunting manuals to be dangerous and associated with demonic forces. So it's kind of like you can't win. You're either a young, slutty, beautiful seductress, or you're a hideous, old, foolish hag. And in any case, you're homicidal, right? You want to kill babies, you want to kill people, you want to blight crops and drink blood and all of this horrible stuff that they believed that witches were doing. You just can't win unless you're a maternal force for good. Otherwise, you're just hypersexualized and, deadly.
It was so funny. Since we brought that up, I was reading a Twitter thread last night that said something like, between conception and birth, you're a female. And then until you're 18, you're a young woman. And then once you become an adult, that makes you a girl. And then once you become older, more mature adult, you become invisible. Mm-hmm. You never get to be a woman.
Exactly. It's really horrifying. I mean, I love that we can laugh at it, but if you actually look at what that means, my goodness, we're just devalued at every stage of our life. And the witch does have this history of being this negative, threatening force, primarily because she was usually a she. And we know that women have not been valued as equal beings for many hundreds and hundreds of years. It felt very important to me to talk about all of that in the book and then move on to, the 19th century, where all of a sudden feminism, the first wave of feminism starts cresting, and suddenly we start seeing the witch become reclaimed and reframed as a sympathetic figure or even a positive figure. And with every wave of feminism, we see a renewed interest in the witch, and we see romanticization of the witch. Exactly. And of people associating her with nature and nurturing and healing and power in a positive, strong, feminist way. So it's really, really interesting. And I feel so grateful that we're now in the fourth wave of feminism, and we're seeing yet again more interest in witches and more links between witches and politics and pop culture and spirituality, all kind of swirled into the brew.
You were talking about the correlation between witches and being nurturing, and that's always been an issue for me in my life, because I'm not the type of person that really likes children. I have a child. He's 21, but it's not my default setting is to be nurturing. And so I really had to work at being a mother. Like, I had to be like, oh yeah, it's time for me to be nice now. I'm very career oriented. And I get told that a lot, that, if you could just be more nurturing, or if you could just be better with children. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, first of all. And secondly, like, there seems to be a thing that if you are powerful, or that you are a witch, or that you have the ability to create in other ways that aren't children, that somehow you are not feminine.
We actually all had a lot to say about that chapter in particular.
We honestly did.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, but this is the chapter Body Monsters, where I talk about the links between our ideas about witches and all of the things we project onto the female body, and all the fears we have, whether it is aging, as with the crone, or it's fear of women who can control their reproductive cycles or choices. And certainly what you're referring to is the ways in which often witches, in stories anyway, don't tend to have children or be part of a family unit. They might be part of a coven, which is its own kind of chosen family, but often in fairy tales anyway, the witch steals someone's baby, or, it was believed during the witch hunts that usually it was women who didn't have children or didn't have enough children who were the most susceptible to becoming witches or being witches. And I myself, I'm happily married, and as I stated, I'm 38 years old, and my husband and I have chosen not to start a family and not to even try to start a family. It's just not in our plan for many various reasons. And I do think that a woman who either just isn't, a mom and when she quote unquote could be in this day and age, even though we are, we've evolved towards believing that women can do anything and be anything, still, when a woman isn't a mom or doesn't love being a mom, we villainize her in the same way we do witches. And so that also has been something that I've been kind of sifting through a lot in my own life, and the ways that, I'm very blessed. We have very wonderful family and friends who don't make us feel this way. But every now and again, I'll meet somebody new at a party or a work function or what have you. And they're like, oh, how many kids do you have? And I'm like, I don't have any kids. And they're immediately kind of awkward. And there are judgments, I think, that they're making. And they'll often say stupid things or ask, nosy questions about it. So, and I think it's interesting that you have a child and you still don't want to be, viewed only as a mom. I think motherhood is beautiful, and I actually do consider myself quite nurturing and loving and maternal, and yet I don't want to do it full time for a child in my house. Yeah.
I love my son completely, and I did a lot for him, and definitely I was there for him. But it was definitely a job for me. It wasn't like something where I was like, yes, I'm going to be a mother now. I'm going to be a mother to all. I always saw my projects. I mean, you're talking about zines. I'm a little older than everybody. I'm 45, but I was definitely a riot girl. I definitely did zines. And I saw my books and my zines and my writing as my children. And I kind of saw that same kind of energy with you, where you put that creative energy or that nurturing energy into your projects or your podcast or communication. So the energy is there, and sure, but it gets put out into the world in a different way. And I never saw having a child as some sort of badge of honor. Like, even when I worked a corporate job, nobody knew I had a child or was even married, because that wasn't that important to me. Yes, my relationships were important to me, but not
as an identity in the world. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it wasn't like a moniker that I had to wear. I was more interested in, how do I become a writer? How do we become a voice in the world? That was what was important to me. So it's just a different energy with it. It's definitely feminine, and I saw a lot of that in your work, especially when you talk about art and when you talk about the Wizard of Oz. I sense that from you, that sense of like that nurturing energy you have goes into that instead. Does that make sense?
It goes into my creative projects, but it also goes into my relationships, and it goes into, I have a lot of kids in my life that I love and I'm nurturing too, but I'm nurturing to them in the, handful of hours or days that I see them, not full time. Yeah, really, really. And for me, I wish it was very simple. I have some friends who are like, oh, I never wanted to be a mom and it's just not what I want to do. And that was really clear. For me, for a while, I thought maybe I did want to be a mom and I wasn't sure. And I had to really explore it and excavate it, because I actually do have, kind of those maternal tendencies at times. It's just my other ones are a lot stronger. I think that's what it is for me.
Yeah. That's actually what really rang true for me. Because when I was reading that chapter, I was like, I've all my life, I grew up in a very Hispanic household because my parents are Hispanic. So, and in the culture, if you're not married and have a kid by at least 25, there's something wrong with you. And I'm the same age as Charlene. So I'm 38. And for me, it was the same thing. It was like every time that I go to a family get together, it's always so when are you going to meet the right guy and get pregnant? And they're like, probably never. Because it's one of the things that you said in that chapter was that the desire to not have a child outweighs the desire to have one. And I felt the same way. And I was like, yeah, that's the thing, because to a certain degree, I do have maternal instincts, and I'm very much like, I want to have a kid. But at the same time, I can't see myself having a kid with what I want to do with the rest of my life. So it's like, I felt like I really had to make a choice. And reading it made me go like, oh, okay, so I'm not like the only one here.
Yeah, and we're a weird breed in that, because I do think there are people who like definitely want them, and there are other people who definitely don't. And people like us who are a little more in the middle, I think a lot of people just then default to, well, I might as well do it because I don't want to regret it. And I understand that. But for me, my husband and I made a different decision because he's also an artist. He's a playwright, and our artistic life and our freedom and our independence is just so sacred and precious. But that doesn't mean that there aren't moments that I don't wonder, or I think whatever you decide, there's always going to be sacrifice, and there's always loss and grieving. Either one. Like, I have a lot of friends who love their children to pieces and are so glad they made that decision, and I know they have nights where they really mourn the loss of their freedom, of their time or their artistic practice or whatever it is.
And for me, I'm very much like you in that, for me as a teen, I knew I didn't want kids. I've been with my honey for 20 years. He wanted them, and we kind of debated it for a while, but eventually we just decided no. We were too busy, and we like our lifestyle the way it is, and having to suddenly be a responsible adult seemed really terrible, and I'm tired enough all the time already, and I like you. I don't know how people do it. Have like their own personal life and have kids, and that was never for me. So honestly, I'm just too mother hen to my friends, and I love to borrow their kids and then give them back.
I take seriously the relationships I have with the children in my life. And as I write in the book, they see me as this magical witchly lady that they can be hyper imaginative with and ask me all kinds of questions about magic and fairy tales and writing and all of these things that I'm sure they can talk about with their parents too, but I don't then have to tell them to like tie their shoelaces or, you know what I mean? Like I don't have to cook them dinner or what have you. So I really enjoy that role very, very much. It's precious to me. And I love these children with all my heart. So it's not like, I don't like kids. I'm not one of those people. I do like kids a lot. I also think about, there are so many children's book authors that I admire who wrote incredible work for children and never had children themselves. And so I think that just goes to show you right there, like you can love children and understand children and relate to children deeply and still then choose to not make them yourself. You're making other things, even if you're making things for them. And I find that really interesting too. A number of people have asked me if I'm going to write a children's book about witches or witchcraft, and I'd really love to. So that's kind of simmering on the back burner as well in a little cauldron for someday.
We've been having this conversation in my household, at least, a lot about how we got to where we are from where we used to be, especially in like the 60s and 70s to the present day. And I love the discussion you had about how the word witch really got to be used in the activist community. Especially with the organization, the WITCH organization. I forget what the acronym stands for now.
Yeah, they changed it all the time. Yes,
because you said that like it had several different things that it stood for throughout time, and it just became revived again on a website in Oregon.
That's right.
And it kind of had that statement, and you put the statement of purpose in the book, but I love how it ends with that whole, like, anyone who claims to be a member is not a member because we are anonymous.
So this was an activist group that started, I'll say kind of humorous, but also political performances and actions in the late 60s. The first one was in 1968. So this group of feminists would get together and they would dress up like witches, and then they would perform kind of activist rituals in public, like they would hex the New York Stock Exchange, or they would do kind of like a witchy protest at Madison Square Garden when there was a big convention about weddings and bridal gowns and things, and they let a bunch of mice loose, and they were kind of sassy and irreverent and tongue-in-cheek, but they were intentionally dressing as witches and calling themselves witch because they saw witches as these oppressed figures throughout history who were actually really powerful and gifted, and who they could reframe as being these subversive change makers and shapeshifters. So it kind of started out sort of as a joke, but also serious, and took on a lot of different iterations over the years, and then kind of went dormant again. And then around the time of the Women's March, just a couple years ago, all of these new witch groups started springing up. And these groups are anonymous. So often the people who are in the witch groups dress as witches, but with black veils over their faces. So you don't know who it is. You don't know who's in the group, and they've been marching at all the various protests. They have often very funny signs, but often very sincere ones, and signs. I'm sure you guys have seen photographs of people holding signs like "Hex the patriarchy" and,
oh, yes.
Yeah.
all of that kind of stuff. And witches believe in science, witches believe in climate change, things like that, which are certainly attention getting, but they operate in that interesting space between performance and ritual and activism and magic. I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in the ways that kind of donning the cloak of the witch or the costume of the witch can be a political act, either, quite literally, as with this group, or with people who are just using various witch language to signify that they are feminists or that they are really against the oppressive, white, cis, heteronormative patriarchy that's in control of everything still.
I had never heard of the demonstration you spoke about in the book where I guess there was a giant protest in Washington where they attempted to levitate the Pentagon.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I remember that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, that was during the big Vietnam protest. And that was earlier than Witch. Actually, the 1968 group Witch kind of sprung out of being inspired by the Yippies, who some of your listeners might be familiar with. And the Yippies were all about these kind of sort of humorous, attention-getting protests. And yes, one of the things they wanted to do was during the big march on the Pentagon was to try and levitate the Pentagon. And Allen Ginsberg was involved, and the filmmaker Kenneth Anger was in attendance, and the rock group The Fugs. It's a really weird and interesting part of our history. And I don't know. I love it because it's funny and irreverent. But also it operates in that space of metaphor that I really appreciate. I think so many people, they just want to know, like, do you actually turn people into frogs or whatever? Like, they get so hung up on literal transformation that political transformation or transforming the spirit or the imagination, the collective imagination of people, they don't necessarily consider magic, but I certainly do.
Absolutely. And I thought that was really fascinating. And it's a good example of the material in the entire book because I had heard of that particular protest, but all the details that you share in the book, I hadn't realized. Like, I hadn't realized the rock group was involved. I hadn't realized that Allen Ginsberg was there. I hadn't realized that it had been such a huge, that so many people, I forgot the number that you put, but I didn't realize that there was so many people at the demonstration and that they actually had gotten a permit to levitate the Pentagon by 10 feet instead of 20 feet that they originally asked for.
Exactly. And I love that the government even negotiated. They were like, well, we don't want it to be so high, but all right, we'll give you 10 feet.
I love it. I can't even imagine the process that would have gone through to be like 20 feet is just not going to happen. But okay,
and the paperwork, like how would that work in paperwork? Like
I know.
Like I need a permit to levitate the Pentagon. Oh yeah, we have those paperworks. Give me a second. Let me go look for them. Like where?
Yeah, this is the form for you.
Exactly.
You need to go to the such and such office for that.
Yeah.
Of levitation. There you go.
I know. But it also just goes to show that someone in the government had a sense of humor too, or maybe they were just curious and they sincerely believed in it. I don't know. And that's what's so interesting about our history as humans, which is that ideas of magic and belief in magic have been with us forever, and they really have influenced culture and politics across the board. Whether or not you believe in literal magic is kind of besides the point. I think it's important to explore the ways and acknowledge the ways in which magic has influenced culture, or ideas about magic or ideas about witches have influenced us.
Ideas about witchcraft and ideas about magic and those things is really evident in the whole chapter about artwork, which I found to be one of the more difficult chapters to get through, simply because I really wish I had been able to see the illustrations.
I know a few people have said that they're like, that's my favorite chapter, but also I had to stop and look up every image you were talking about. And unfortunately,
I did too.
Yeah, we just didn't have, a budget for image rights. Wouldn't it be amazing to have an illustrated edition of this book though? Ooh,
absolutely, I'd love it. Absolutely. But I highly recommend anyone reading the book do take time, as you mentioned, the artists and the specific art pieces to stop and look them up as you go, because it really adds so much to the experience.
Yes, I agree.
My mind was blown. I could not believe there were all these artists out there that I had never heard of. And they were doing such incredible art, especially, Georgianna Houghton.
Yes, she was a medium, and she was doing incredible abstract drawings that were being channeled to her, or that she was channeling, before even Hilma af Klint, who some of your listeners might know her name, because Hilma af Klint was just given this huge show at the Guggenheim. It's the most attended show in the Guggenheim Museum's history, and I write about her in the book as well, and she was she was doing abstract art before even Kandinsky was. But Georgianna Houghton was doing it even before her by almost like a full 50 years. So that I think is important to show that the link between people who were exploring the immaterial realm and modern art is immense. I mean, one could argue that all of modern art is derived from occult explorations.
It really blew my mind too that, for one, they were women who were doing abstract art way before the men who got credit for it.
Yep.
Two, I hate abstract art by a lot, but theirs is so beautiful. It's very different from what you think of when you think of abstract art. Like, there's motion and flow to it that is very, very perceptible, and it's very textural in a way that other abstract art that you think of is not. And that it was so completely based in this spiritual reality and spiritual practice of theirs. And that later on you go on to discuss how people completely dismiss it. And they say, well, that doesn't count as being the beginning of the abstract art movement because nobody knew about them and nobody gave them any credit. So it completely doesn't count as new or revolutionary.
Exactly. And you know, it's interesting to hear you say that you hate abstract art, because I wasn't the hugest fan of it when I was growing up either. I tended to gravitate towards more figurative works where I could really recognize, I love surrealism. That's my very favorite kind of movement in art history, because it is figurative, but it's also very magical and dreamy and peculiar. That said, the more I've studied occult history and just the history of magical ideas, the more I've become a huge fan of abstract art, because I've come to realize that so much of abstract art is the artist trying to have this transcendent experience and then come up with a new visual language to try to relay that experience or try to transmit messages from the spiritual realm. And I think if we were taught to engage with abstract art in this more spiritual or even more intuitive, embodied, emotional way, this sensorial way, rather than how a lot of us are trained to be more cerebral about it, I think a lot of us would engage with the work very differently.
Very cool. Is there anything else you want to say? Like, where do you get your book?
What are you doing? Where can we find you? When's the next book coming out?
Oh, hooray.
All the good stuff.
Let's see. All the good stuff. Well, Waking the Witch came out here in the U.S., so most of what I'm doing is I'm still in promotion mode. And so doing lots of events. You can find out about those by going to my website, pamgrossman.com, and clicking on events. And I'm adding new ones all the time. And beyond that, just figuring out all kinds of other projects and writing and what's next kind of things. But honestly, I'm also trying to just be present and trying to enjoy the summer and relax, because it's been such a wild 2 years working on this book and getting it out in the world. So I don't know. I'm watching Netflix too. You know what I mean?
Getting caught up on your queue.
Exactly. Catching up on the queue, catching up on podcasts, reading some good books, doing some vacationing, hanging out with my cats and my husband, and just trying to catch my breath.
It's obvious you did a ton of research and did a lot of work on Waking the Witch. I was expecting a much lighter read, but this was so crunchy and good and well referenced and well researched, and just it resonated so well. So it was really a delightful, crunchy surprise, and I appreciate all those things that you're doing. Those are on your website, yes?
Yeah, so that's all on my website. And then I should add that Waking the Witch just came out in the UK earlier this week, and it's about to be translated into German and Spanish. So hopefully more languages to come as well. Fingers crossed. So yeah, I'm so honored and delighted that you enjoyed the book, and it means a lot to me that people who both are practitioners and aren't practitioners all seem to be getting something out of the book, because it really hopefully has something for everybody. So thank you.
And congratulations on getting it into other languages. I know it's always an amazing feat when they're like, hey, it's doing so well, let's do it in other languages. So that's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the We Witches 3 podcast. For show notes and links, please go to www.wewitches3.com.